Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be taking a look at Chapter 6 of Jared Diamond's Guns, Germs, and Steel. Specifically, we're going to be talking about the evolution from hunter-gatherers to farming. One of the things we're going to take a look at is why farming actually took place and some of the factors of how we went from hunter-gatherers to farming. So let's get into the video. As always, I will only be going over a fraction of the information in the book, so please check out the book for yourself. I will link it in the description below. This is typically going to be information where you can use both prior to your starting your novel as well as other drafts later. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that the bigger the change in our world building, the earlier we have to incorporate it into our story. For instance, if we learn something about world building that doesn't make sense in the world we're trying to create, the earlier we have that in our story, the better. For instance, if there are no specific types of animals, yet later on you need a particular type of animal. Say for instance, if your world has no horses, then you have to make sure that you put that into the story earlier on. Now, what's going to have an effect on how things develop is what your plans are for the totality of your story. So let's get into it. Chapter 6. Formerly, all people on Earth were hunter-gatherers. Why did any of them adopt food production at all? This is a very serious question we need to be asking ourselves when it comes to how our world, developed. Why move from a position where you are able to move around, you're able to avoid other people, you're able to develop a system that is able to sustain you long term? Given that they must have had some reason, why do they do so around 8500 BC in the Mediterranean habitats of the Fertile Crescent, only 3,000 years later in the climatically and structurally similar Mediterranean habitats of southwestern Europe, and never indigenously in similar Mediterranean habitats of California, southwestern Australia, and the Cape of South Africa? Why do the people of the Fertile Crescent wait until 8500 BC instead of becoming food producers around 18500 or 28500 BC? These are some of the questions we need to be asking ourselves when we tell our story and have us understand why things have developed the way that they do. Archaeologists have determined the first farmers in many areas were smaller and less well nourished, suffered from more serious diseases, and died on the average at a younger age than the hunter-gatherers they replaced. If those first farmers could have foreseen the consequences of adopting food production, they might not have opted to do so. Why? Unable to foresee the results, they nevertheless make that choice. One of the things that happens in our modern culture is that sometimes we forget that the evolution from hunter-gatherers to where we are today is just a simple step process. But that's actually not the case. There are so many smaller intermediary steps between that. It's not like we're a simple flight of stairs from hunter-gatherers to modern day, but rather it is a series of up and down steps that our ancestors made, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. There are many factors that have directed the course of our evolution from hunter-gatherers. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that we need to make sure that we're paying attention in our own stories, that we aren't taking leaps of faith of how things are playing out. We can't just say, well, they were hunter-gatherers one time, and then the next time they were technologically advanced. There's so much that goes into it, things that can change the course of a world's history simply by how it plays into the development. So what we need to make sure that we're doing is that we're saying, hey, I understand that this is happening, and these are the factors that are leading up to this point. A single change can direct the flow of history. For instance, if horses appeared in Mesoamerica, how much different would that be than as they had developed in Asia, in the West? These are factors that would have drastically changed the course of history. These are some things that we can't necessarily just disregard. We can just say, hey, this is the world that we're creating. But if we're trying to make a more complete story, if we're trying to make a more complete history of our worlds, we need to keep these things in mind. For instance, Aboriginal hunter-gatherers of southeastern Australia traded for thousands of years with farmers of the Torres Strait Island between Australia and New Guinea. California Native American hunter-gatherers traded with Native American farmers in the Colorado Valley. In addition, Koi hoarders west of the Fish River of the South Africa traded with Bantu farmers east of the Fish River and continued to dispense with farming themselves. Why? These are some of the things that were odd about how the world developed. You would think that it's just a continual progress from one point to another, but that's not always going to be the case. Why, if you are hunting gathering, would you set up to do farming? There is something that is set a pattern that you understand, and you don't want to leave that. Leaving those patterns is a risk, something we're going to go over in a little bit. But these are how people actually thought. These are how people actually developed themselves as well as their culture. Now we understand it as that the move from hunter-gatherers to farmers was critical in our development into a more modern species. But we need to make sure that we are showing this how it takes place rather than just saying, oh, this happened. Some modern nomads in New Guinea's Lakes Plains made clearings in the jungle, plant bananas and papayas, go off for a few months to live again as hunter and gatherers, return to check their crops, weed the garden if they find crops growing, and set off again to hunt. Return months later to check again and settle down for a while to harvest and eat if their garden has produced. These are typically how the development takes place. Sometimes this way, they are not necessarily giving up the benefits of being hunter-gatherers, being able to move, being able to find food a lot easier than for hunting gathering, because say they leave, something happens, a catastrophic event takes place, and the food that they have developed over the course of how many months is completely wiped out. These are things that we can keep in mind in telling our stories. Have we set up a situation where the hunter-gatherers have slowly developed over the course of the millennia to become the people that we need them to be? Another supposed dichotomy that comes blurred in reality is the distinction between food producers as active managers of their land and hunter-gatherers as mere collectors of wild produce. These are things that we have to keep in mind is when we're talking about it's not just a hunter-gatherer versus farmer. These aren't always going to be these two distinct mindsets. Sometimes there's a mixture. Sometimes there's like we talked about earlier, you have hunter-gatherers that are able to collect specific types of items. So for instance, if you are hunting a particular type of fish, you can bring that to farmers and they can add different types of meat depending on the type of animals that are in the area. For instance, if you have hunter-gatherers and they're able to collect pelts, they can sell those to the farmers because the farmers don't necessarily have time to go out and hunt the animals that they need the pelts for. Leather is a critical aspect of producing food. It's used throughout agrarian cultures. Typically, nowadays, we get our leather, sometimes synthetic, but a lot of times it comes from cows that we slaughter for food. That way we aren't wasting what we have. Leather is quite plentiful, but in a hunter-gatherer, they have more pelts than they know what to do with, whereas an agrarian culture is always going to have a need of pelts. This is the way that there's a symbiotic relationship between hunter-gatherers and farmers. Conversely, men hunters tend to guide themselves by consideration of prestige. For example, they might rather go draft hunting every day, bag a draft once a month, and thereby gain the status of great hunter, or bring home twice a draft's weight of food in a month by humbling themselves and reliably gathering nuts every day. One of the things that sometimes we forget is that that type of behavior is actually what brought us to today. As I mentioned earlier, risk takers, people who are willing to step out the norm, are critical to the development of a culture. You cannot have the same behavior in and out every day and expect to have a development of culture. You always have to have a certain number of people that are risk takers, people that are competent enough to do the job so that they could find a better way of doing it. In the example given here, the person, the male who is desiring to go achieve prestige will go out draft hunting. The issue is that because draft hunting is not a activity where you actually get a lot of meat from, because some days you're just not that fortunate, you go out and try to bag a draft. If this goes on for months, you don't have enough food to keep yourself going. You literally starve because you are incompetent. Only the people who are competent, that are able to bag a giraffe or bag a wildlife, are able to survive long term. Now, this is bulwarked by if you have a mix of people who are hunting meat and gathering edible foods, which is typically what happens with the hunter-gatherers. But what happens is that the giraffe not only provides meat, it only provides energy in the food, but it also provides skins. Skins that can be used in places like tents, bones that can be used for tools. There are more than just this is what's just for the meat, but they try to use as much of the animals that they are capturing as much as possible. So there has to be a level of risk taking. Now, the risk is mitigated by education. If you have a hunter that knows what they're doing, they can take on somebody who is less talented or less skillful and train them to become as skilled, or at least skilled enough that they can actually produce food without their hand being held. These are ways that society has tried to limit the consequences of a lack of knowledge by education. People are also guided by seemingly arbitrary cultural preferences, such as considering fish either delicacies or taboo. In our stories, how are we showing these inconsistencies between culture? Are you having situations where this group of people feels this way, while this group of people feel another way? In all parts of the world where adequate evidence is available, archaeologists find evidence of rising densities associated with the appearance of food production. Which is the cause and which is the result? This is a long debated chicken or the egg problem. Did the rise of human population density force people to turn to food production, or did the food production permit a rise of human population density? Sometimes there are other factors that are involved. For instance, if we're not necessarily talking about a density within a particular tribe, so say you have over the course of a couple hundred years, one tribe has a span of a couple 100 miles which they can gather food from. Within a couple 100 years, as groups split off, as other tribes are developed, that population overall means that that singular tribe no longer has the hundreds of miles, but rather has 50 miles. These are ways that, as we've talked about in other videos, some of the ways that they can deal with this is either by limiting their population growth by castration or by developing food. Because the inability to move around limits how people are able to gather food, they might choose, if they have no other option, then to say, hey, we need to start planting, we need to find a way of providing food for us more long term. Here are some questions you need to ask yourself when it comes to your writing. What are the causes for movement to farming, i.e. religious, natural event, natural evolution? So for instance, it's not uncommon for diseases to sweep through a particular animal group. In America, if the population of the deers comes too dense due to not hunting, what can end up happening is it forces the animals to come together closer in proximity, and disease can easily spread from one to the other. Thus, it creates a problem because the disease wipes out a majority of these creatures that can now not be used for hunting and food. So, what are other events that could be taking place? A religious. So, for instance, if you have a situation where, because of certain events that take place on certain times, the culture believes that a particular food is taboo or cannot be eaten because it is a religious symbol, how does that affect how the development of the people takes place? Or are we talking a more natural evolution, as we discussed before, where there was a purely hunter-gatherer, moved to a quasi-hunter-gatherer, and moved into a agrarian culture? That's a natural development that one would see and take place. How do the different areas' demographics play into the transition to farming? So for instance, If you have a particular area that is rich in wildlife but is not acceptable to different types of farming, what can end up happening is that if the population is unable to continue hunting for food, they can either A, move, one of the benefits of hunter-gatherers, or B, die out, or integrate themselves into another culture that has already moved to farming. This is something that we've talked about in other videos, is that you'll have sometimes that you'll have hunter-gatherer groups or hunter-gatherer clans, tribes, and they develop into a certain way, but sometimes if they are hunting and gathering in a particular area, how much energy are they going to be putting into making that land arable? Typically, hunter-gatherers stay in wooded area because that's where the animals are going to be, particularly the animals that are going to have higher levels of food. So for instance, you're not necessarily going to see a whole lot of deer in the plains, but you're going to see a lot more in the wooded area. If you go to the Great Plains of the United States, you're not going to see animals such as deer. You'll see larger animals, which are going to be harder to hunt, like buffalo, or you're going to see much smaller animals, like prairie dogs, things that are going to be harder to hunt based on the fact that they go underground. These are different ways of seeing the situation. Typically, hunter-gatherers are going to be looking for the most efficient way of gathering calories. Not that they understand that, but they're looking for the most efficient way of gathering calories at the least amount of risk for themselves. So, while you take a look at a singular bison, and the Native Americans are going to say, hey, this is a way of producing food for ourselves by hunting them. If a singular Native American tries to do that, what's going to end up happening? They're going to get killed because of how the animals protect themselves. Because bison are so much larger than Native American Indians, they had to resort to other ways of getting food. One of the ways that they ended up doing this is by actually creating a stampede, which killed a lot of the animals, ended up actually causing a lot of waste. And when things are more difficult to hunt, people will find different ways of trying to gather that food that gives them the least amount of risk. How do personality traits in the population affect how the transition takes place? As we talked about earlier, when it comes to men and how men tend to be the risk takers because of this, how does that type of personality affect the population growth? For instance, if you have a whole population where everybody is risk adverse, they rely on the status quo or they rely on tradition in how they produce food. Does that group ever move away from hunter-gatherers, or they move beyond that? Are you creating stories where people are inherently the same between risk-taking particularly? There's a reason why men tend to be a lot more aggressive. There's a reason why they tend to be a lot more risk-taking. Now, that's not to say that there aren't downsides to this. How our world deals with these things is not the same way that hunter-gatherers would. For instance, a male that is a lot more aggressive tends to be willing to take the risks that will get him what he wants. Whereas today, that can be seen as a bad thing. Somebody who is more aggressive is inherently seen as a bad person. Because of how our culture is structured today, somebody who is of the similar risk-taking perspective is not necessarily seen in the same light. That's not to say that there aren't people who appreciate it. Even then, people recognize the benefits of a risk taker. That's why we laud people who have done great things, have done things that are not easy to do. These are things that we need to keep in mind in our own stories. All right, so overall, these are some of the things that we need to keep in mind when we're telling our stories. How things are developing across time when it comes to hunting, gathering, to farming. How people are and their personalities are affecting the transition from hunter-gatherers to farming. And how our cultural elements that can change the course of history, affecting how things play out. And if say, for instance, you have a religious element to the story, how does that play out? Do you have demigods that are influencing how the world is evolving? Are you having the actual gods step in and changing how the story takes place? I know for myself, in my work in progress, one of the big factors that it comes from going from a hunting gathering to an agrarian culture is that we have a character who's brought from our world, ancient Egypt, who brings with him almonds, different seeds that he can then use to create an agrarian culture, sidestepping a lot of the guessing that takes place in the early agrarian cultures. A lot of the sidestepping of selecting plants that actually work for food. If we take just those periods of time, sometimes between early hunter-gatherers and ancient Egypt, a lot of those issues have been addressed. A lot of those questions of what are good foods? How are things present in today's society that we use today? Not many changes have taken place from ancient Egypt to today in regards to the types of foods that we eat. Now, the process that we use it and how there's the processing methods that have changed, these are things that we need to keep in mind in our story. All right, everybody, that's all I had for today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, please leave it in the comment section below. As always, I will be linking the resources I use in the description below. Until next time, bye.
I am a poor, wayfaring stranger. I'm traveling through this world of woe, yet there's no sickness, toil, nor danger in that bright land to which I go.